In the early spring of 1864, for the first time in a great while, Abraham Lincoln had reasons to be hopeful. It was true, the great victory which the Army of the Potomac had won at Gettysburg the previous July had not been followed up to the complete victory he had hoped for, but it was a victory, and a major one. And it had been followed by more victories in the West, at Vicksburg and Chattanooga, and by a general whom Lincoln hoped would be the key to final victory, Ulysses S. Grant. It was with that hope that Lincoln arranged to bring Grant to Washington, promote him to the rank of lieutenant general, and put Grant in control of the Army of the Potomac's operations. Not until Grant was in command, Lincoln claimed, had he been able to sleep at night here in Washington. Grant responded by drafting an ambitious plan for winning the war. As soon as winter released its grip on the muddy Virginia roads, he would strike south into Virginia on the old track which lay across the Rappahannock River, where he would grapple with the rebels, with Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. Unlike the generals before him, Grant made no extravagant promises about beating Lee the first time they met. In fact, Grant proposed to use his grapple with Lee along the Rappahannock as a means for pinning Lee down, while a smaller Union force under General Benjamin Butler slipped down the Chesapeake Bay, made a surprise landing on the James River Peninsula, and struck swiftly at the Confederate capital at Richmond while its defenders were occupied with Grant. At the same time, far away in Tennessee and Georgia, Grant's old Western Army, now under his picked successor, William Tecumseh Sherman, would jump off from Chattanooga and march on Atlanta. And yet another federal force under Nathaniel Banks would strike across Mobile and seize all of southern Alabama. Every part of the Confederacy would be pressed simultaneously so that no one part could come to the aid of the other. "Oh, yes, I see that," Lincoln remarked to Grant. "As we say out west, those not skinning can hold a leg." Lincoln also had good reason to be hopeful about politics. All the while the war had been raging, Lincoln had also been promoting an ambitious domestic agenda in Congress. It was, in effect, an effort to put Henry Clay's old American system into place. Like Clay and the old Whigs, Lincoln prodded a willing Republican Congress into a series of generous moves that would promote American business and American economic competitiveness abroad. Just as he'd been a moving force for the Illinois Central Railroad in his days as an Illinois state legislator, Lincoln, as president, sponsored the laying of a transcontinental railroad in 1863 to the tune of almost $500 million. To protect American industries from foreign competition, Lincoln and Congress pushed protective tariff rates to an all-time high of 47%, 2.5 times what they had been in 1860. And in 1863, a National Banking Act reestablished a national banking system, something which Andrew Jackson had dismantled 30 years before. This was an economic program of breathtaking scope. And we tend to forget how ambitious it was only because, at the same time, there was a civil war on. But it's safe to say that even if there had been no civil war, Lincoln's administration would have been known as a revolutionary one simply for this economic program. For at one stroke, Lincoln undid the work of 6 decades of Democratic presidents, from Thomas Jefferson to James Buchanan, and established a new relationship between business and government which lasted until 1932. Oddly, the man who helped him accomplish much of this, his Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, was also the man who nursed the strongest ambitions for dumping Lincoln and advertising himself as the best Republican candidate for the presidency in the election year of 1864. But even with Chase, Lincoln had good news at the start of 1864. Chase's political friends, who may have had the worst sense of political timing in American political history, circulated a memorandum in February of 1864, pumping Chase for the presidency. The circular was mailed, however, over the free postage privileges of Ohio Senator John Sherman. This appalled party regulars, who could not believe that Chase would use what was, in effect, the government's resources to destabilize the administration of a sitting president. Chase's boom for the presidency fizzled. In February, the Republican National Committee endorsed Lincoln for the presidency again. In June, Chase resigned from the cabinet. And in October, Lincoln kicked him safely upstairs by appointing Chase Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Lincoln might have had some second thoughts about his hopes if he had realized that the Confederates on the other side of the Rappahannock were also feeling fairly optimistic as well. Despite the loss at Gettysburg, the Army of Northern Virginia had never been beaten on its own soil, and there was no reason to suppose it would now. And despite the loss of Vicksburg in the West, the Confederacy still held the Lower South and Atlanta. And to restore confidence in the Confederacy's Western Army, the Army of Tennessee, Jefferson Davis appointed as a new commander in the West Joseph E. Johnston, whose genius for defensive warfare made it clear that William Tecumseh Sherman would have no easy time of getting to Atlanta. "I feel so hopeful about the coming campaign," wrote one of Lee's generals on April 15th. "I have never felt so encouraged before." One of Jefferson Davis's military attachés returned from an inspection tour of the Army of Tennessee to report that the Army is in excellent spirits. Davis had given up on any expectation by now of intervention in the war from the European nations. But if these rebel armies in Virginia and Georgia could fight defensively, either throw back Grant and Sherman or just hold the line, then it might cause enough war weariness in the North that Northern voters might take out their frustration on Lincoln in the fall elections and elect a Democratic administration that would agree to an immediate truce. Once a truce in this war was proclaimed, it would be nearly impossible to imagine restarting the war, so that in one form or another, the independence of the Confederacy would be assured. And that was exactly what looked like would happen as the armies lumbered into motion at the beginning of May 1864. Grant struck south with the Army of the Potomac across the Rappahannock River into the tangled scrub of the Wilderness, the same wilderness where Joe Hooker had met his nemesis exactly 1 year before. There in the Wilderness, Lee craftily snapped an ambush onto the Army of the Potomac as it was strung along the narrow roads of the Wilderness. And in a nasty 2-day free-for-all, the Army of the Potomac's nose was once again badly bloodied, Grant or no Grant, to the whopping tune of 17,000 casualties. Any other Northern commander before this, like McClellan or Hooker or Burnside, would have withdrawn back to the other side of the Rappahannock River. But Grant had a larger scheme in mind. Rather than withdrawing, he intended to keep on moving. He wrote back to Washington, "I am now sending back all my wagons for a fresh supply of provisions and ammunition, and purpose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." The ordinary soldiers of the Army of the Potomac had been waiting for this moment, waiting to see whether Grant was made of different stuff than their previous commanders. And they very quickly learned that he was. The morning after the Wilderness battle, Grant mounted up his staff and began riding south. Grant's military standing with the enlisted men this day hung on the direction we turned, wrote one artilleryman. If to the left, back to the Rappahannock River, he was to be rated with Meade and Hooker and Burnside. But we turned to the right. Instantly, all of us heard a sigh of relief. Our spirits rose. We marched free. The men began to sing. The enlisted men understood the flanking movement. That night, we were happy. Grant actually began sidling to the left, trying to curl around Lee's army. Lee was forced to step back and over to face Grant again. And again, there was a vicious battle at a county seat crossroads named Spotsylvania Courthouse. Again, the casualties piled up grotesquely. Some 18,000 Union and 11,000 Confederate. Again, Grant, instead of pulling back, slid to the left again, all the while shifting closer and closer to Richmond, all the while giving Lee less and less maneuvering room. By June 1st, Grant had worked his way down to the village of Cold Harbor, just 10 miles northeast of Richmond. And there he launched his third big attack of the campaign. Like the Wilderness and Spotsylvania, it also failed, to the cost of another 7,000 Union casualties. All of this might have made better sense if Benjamin Butler had used the strategic distraction of Grant's campaign to launch his planned attack up the James River Peninsula. But Butler botched his assignment. Landing 30,000 Union troops on the James River on May 5th, Butler was faced by only 5,000 Confederate defenders, but he hesitated. A week after landing, allowing the rebels to draft hasty reinforcements from the Carolinas. And when Butler finally got into motion, he was driven back to the James River, where the Confederates corked him into a harmless defensive perimeter. Faced with Butler's failure, Grant had no choice but to try to do Butler's job himself. On the night of June 12, 1864, Grant silently pulled back from his position at Cold Harbor, stole south across the James River, and on June 15th, the lead elements of the Army of the Potomac were outside the Richmond suburb of Petersburg and ready to march over only 2,500 rebel defenders. But again, hesitation set in among Grant's lead officers. Punchy from a month of bloody battles, they dallied long enough for Lee to rush to the rescue of Petersburg. There was nothing for it now except for both armies to dig in and begin a siege. So much for Grant's great plan to end the war in the East. Much the same thing happened in the West. William Tecumseh Sherman marched out of Chattanooga on the same day that Grant crossed the Rappahannock River. But his Confederate opponent, Joseph Johnston, slyly tic-tacked across northern Georgia, delaying Sherman at one point after another, slowing every possible advance. Sherman grew so frustrated that on June 27th, 1864, he tried attacking Johnston's dug-in Confederates at Kennesaw Mountain. Johnston's Confederates easily repulsed him, and both armies went back to tic-tacking. Finally, by the beginning of September, Sherman had reached the outskirts of Atlanta. But all he found there was Joe Johnston securely entrenched around the city. Like Grant at Petersburg, Sherman had no choice but to settle into a time-consuming and depressing siege. The contrast between the high hopes of the spring and the bitter disappointments of the summer of 1864 was almost incalculable. The horrendous casualty lists had, in Northern eyes, produced absolutely nothing except 2 useless sieges. And as if to show that he still had plenty of punch, Lee detached 10,000 veteran rebels under Jubal Early and sent them on a daring raid up the Shenandoah Valley, right up to the ring of forts around Washington, and then up into Pennsylvania, where the marauding rebels burned the town of Chambersburg. Our bleeding, bankrupt, almost dying country longs for peace, the New York newspaper editor Horace Greeley advised Lincoln, and shudders at the prospect of fresh conscriptions, of further wholesale devastations, and of new rivers of human blood. The chair of the Republican National Committee, Henry J. Raymond, pleaded with Lincoln to do something, anything, to avoid an electoral debacle in November. The tide, said Raymond, is setting strongly against us. Nothing but the most resolute and decided action on the part of the government and its friends can save the country from falling into hostile hands. Why would it not be wise, under these circumstances, to appoint a commissioner in due form to make distinct proffers of peace to Davis as the head of the rebel armies, on the sole condition of acknowledging the supremacy of the Constitution, all other questions to be settled in a convention of the people of all the states? Even Lincoln himself grew despondent. The people promised themselves, when General Grant started out, that he would take Richmond in June, Lincoln told a New York politician. He didn't take it, and they blame me. At the end of the summer, the Northern Democrats, sensing an opportunity for victory, nominated as their presidential candidate for the November election no one less than General George B. McClellan, on a platform that promised an immediate start of peace talks with the Confederates. At a cabinet meeting on August 23rd, Lincoln asked his cabinet to witness a document containing explicit directions for the management of a presidential transition. Since this morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be reelected. The Confederates, for just the very same reasons, were jubilant. Confederate peace commissioners set up quarters on the neutral Canadian side of Niagara Falls and contacted Lincoln through Horace Greeley, offering to begin negotiations. Atlantans were convinced that Sherman's army had overextended itself and that the Yankees would soon be cut to pieces by Johnston. The Charleston Mercury predicted that a McClellan election must lead to peace and our independence, provided that for the next 2 months we hold our own and prevent military success by our foes. But in fact, the situation made the Confederates too reckless. For the Confederacy was actually on far thinner ice than it seemed. By the end of 1864, widespread disaffection with the cost of the war was wearing the Confederacy beyond exhaustion. The federal blockade was choking the Confederate economy, which was almost entirely based on the export of cotton. Federal military occupation of much of the Upper South had disrupted the Southern transportation system and deprived the South of its most valuable granaries. and the steady drain of the war on Southern white manpower left the aged and the women and the children prey to raiding Federals and fear of slave insurrections. Desertion was now becoming a serious problem in the Confederate armies, as rebel soldiers thought more of fighting to defend their homesteads rather than fighting in Georgia or Virginia. In some places that were still nominally under Confederate control, like western North Carolina, resistance to Confederate tax collectors and draft officers had grown so great that these areas had almost become no-go zones for Jefferson Davis's government. Peace parties were forming in North Carolina. And in the governor's election in North Carolina that summer, incumbent Zebulon Vance was opposed by an out-and-out peace candidate, William Holden. It was even rumored that Georgia's feisty governor, Joe Brown, was negotiating secretly with William Tecumseh Sherman. Although the sieges around Atlanta and Petersburg looked like very successful stalemates on the surface for the Confederates, Jefferson Davis realized that he needed something more than a stalemate. He wanted Federal defeat at the end of the summer, so that would send Northerners howling to the polls in anguish. And so on July 17th, Davis replaced the defensive-minded Joseph Johnston and gave command of the defense of Atlanta to John Bell Hood. Hood was an unstable but highly aggressive general who promised to come out of the trenches and fight Sherman face to face, which was, of course, exactly what Sherman wanted. On July 20th, Hood began a series of assaults on Sherman's troops, which cost him 15,000 rebel casualties and netted Hood exactly nothing except a return to the siege lines around Atlanta. 6 weeks later, Sherman was ready for his own attack, swinging south of the city and forcing Hood to attack him in order to protect Atlanta's supply lines. Hood failed disastrously. And on September 2nd, Hood abandoned Atlanta to Sherman. "Atlanta is ours," Sherman exultantly telegraphed Lincoln, and fairly won. 500 miles away, another piece of good news was contributed by Federal Admiral David Glasgow Farragut, the same Farragut who had taken New Orleans back in the spring of 1862. Farragut steamed boldly into Mobile Bay on August 5th, 1864, silencing the harbor's outer defenses, forcing the surrender of a Confederate ironclad warship, the Tennessee, and making national headlines with his salty promise to dam the torpedoes and go full steam ahead. In the Shenandoah Valley, Jubal Early's Confederate raiders were caught in October by Ulysses Grant's adventurous cavalry commander, Philip Sheridan, at Cedar Creek, and scattered as an effective fighting force. These victories put the wind back into Lincoln's political sails. After Atlanta, Mobile Bay, and Cedar Creek, all talk of negotiating a peace with the Confederates looked foolish. And George McClellan did not help himself when he decided to quarrel with the Democratic Party's platform by insisting that he would only negotiate for a reunion of the country, not to recognize Confederate independence. Given Confederate unwillingness to discuss anything except independence, this was as good as saying that McClellan, as president, would continue the war, only less effectively. The result was a stampede to Lincoln. On November 8th, 1864, Lincoln won 55% of the popular vote and captured 212 electoral votes to McClellan's 21. McClellan carried only New Jersey and the border slave states of Delaware and Kentucky. But the victory was all the sweeter because there was no reason why Lincoln had needed to have run the hazard of the election at all. In the midst of a civil war, Lincoln could not have been seriously blamed if he had decreed that the national emergency of the war meant that elections would have to be delayed or temporarily suspended. But the thought never seems to have crossed Lincoln's mind. We cannot have free government without elections, Lincoln explained. And if the rebellion could force us to forego or postpone a national election, it might fairly claim to have already conquered and ruined us. By running the risk of a popular referendum on the war, Lincoln had actually emerged doubly victorious. And the most telling statistic was from the soldiers' vote. No one had better reason for wanting peace than the soldiers. No one had once held the loyalty of the soldiers closer than George McClellan. But on November 8th, 78% of the soldier vote went to Lincoln. The North had its second wind. It was now time to finish the job. That winter, pieces of the Confederacy began to collapse inwards. Opposition to Jefferson Davis and the Confederate Congress now rose to record levels. Desertion throughout the rebel armies became epidemic. Sherman, not content with the capture of Atlanta, was on the march again in November, burning a 60-mile wide swath of pure destruction across the state to Savannah, which he captured on December 21st. I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah, Sherman wired Lincoln, with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition, and also about 25,000 bales of cotton. And then, hardly without pausing, Sherman bounced northwards again, crossing into South Carolina, and then up into North Carolina with the aim of linking up forces with Grant at Petersburg. What was left of the Confederate armies in the West was put under Joseph Johnston again, but Johnston had given up hope. "I can do no more than annoy him," Johnston warned Lee about Sherman. "I respectfully suggest that it is no longer a question whether you leave your present position. You have only to decide where to meet Sherman. I will be near him." Finally, in February of 1865, Jefferson Davis responded again to suggestions for peace talks and sent a delegation headed by Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens to meet with Secretary of State William Seward at Hampton Roads, Virginia. All of this presented Abraham Lincoln with an unlooked-for problem. On the one hand, no one wanted the end of the war to come more quickly than Abraham Lincoln. The bill for a single day of this war was running at over $10 million. And as if that was not enough, the longer the war lasted and the more destruction was caused in the South, the harder it would be to reconstruct a workable economy in the South. On the other hand, Lincoln could not afford to have the war end too soon either. The Emancipation Proclamation may have put an end to some slavery, but not all of it. And it had done so purely by Lincoln's military authority in time of war as commander-in-chief. That authority might not last 1 minute beyond the end of the war. And there was nothing which excluded the bizarre but entirely real possibility that once the war ended, Southern slaveholders might appeal the proclamation's authority in the federal courts. And given the memory of the Dred Scott case, there was no predicting what the result might be. With those considerations in view, Lincoln pressed ahead with the proposal for a 13th Amendment to the Constitution, abolishing slavery completely and beyond contest by the federal courts. He agreed to meet with the Confederate commissioners at Hampton Roads in February, but he refused to make any concessions on the necessity for reunification first and negotiation afterwards. And the peace talks fell through. Jefferson Davis hoped that the failure of the Hampton Roads peace talks would show Southerners that they were going to get no terms from Lincoln that they could live with, and that they would be inspired to fight all the harder as the spring of 1865 came on. The problem was that there was so little left to fight with. Lee's once great army of Northern Virginia had been so enfeebled by desertion over the winter that when Grant renewed his attacks on Petersburg at the end of March 1865, Lee advised Jefferson Davis that it would be necessary for him to abandon both Petersburg and Richmond. Davis fled south with the Confederate cabinet and the Confederate treasury gold. Lee hastily retreated west, hoping to pick up supplies in Lynchburg and then swing south to link up with Joe Johnston in North Carolina. Neither of them ever had a chance. Grant jumped up in pursuit of Lee as soon as Lee had abandoned Petersburg and ran his tattered army to the ground a week later at Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee reluctantly surrendered on April 9th rather than bring on one last pointless battle. He had only 26,000 men with him at the end. 2 weeks later, Joe Johnston surrendered his little army to Sherman at Durham Station, North Carolina. Other Confederate forces, scattered here and there, surrendered one by one. On May 26th, the last organized Confederate force in Texas, commanded by Edmund Kirby Smith, surrendered. On May 10th, Federal cavalry captured Jefferson Davis near Irwinville, Georgia. The war was at last and suddenly over. But the window of opportunity for rejoicing was short. 5 days after Lee's surrender, while Washington was still giddy from the news of victory, a prominent actor and one-time Confederate secret agent named John Wilkes Booth talked his way into the presidential box at Ford's Theater, where Abraham Lincoln was relaxing, watching a play. Booth produced a pistol and shot Lincoln in the head. Lincoln died without regaining consciousness the next morning. Now, the problems of peace looked like they might become even greater than the problems of war. And that's what we'll take up after a break.